Hello, welcome. What a wonderful crowd. Thank you all for coming out. I'm Brian McLean. I'm the program manager here at the Eli and Edith Broad Art Museum, and I'd like to welcome you and thank you all. We're very excited tonight to have with us Scott Hocking, our current field station artist, on view in our gallery here in the other space on the first level. If you haven't had a chance to check it out, please do. That exhibit will be on display until September 30th, so you have a little bit of time, but if you haven't already, I encourage you to get in and check it out. So this is kind of just how this is going to go down tonight. I'm welcoming you, so welcome. In a couple of minutes, our associate curator, Carla Acevedo-Yates, will come up to introduce Scott and give some background information on him and his practice. And so that's how that's going to work. And then once Scott has a chance to talk, we will go in. We like to offer a few minutes of Q&A. So we will have maybe 20, 15 minutes for some Q&A afterwards. So while Scott's talking, be sure to store those questions away and be ready for those. So Carla might speak a little bit to the field station as an exhibition cycle, but I'll just say it's an annual cycle of projects that sort of gives a space to artists to experiment on new work, on new projects. So its focus is giving them that space to sort of experiment. So just a couple of other things that I wanted to announce. His show's coming down September 30th. Our next field station artist is Matthew Angelo Harrison. He'll open on October 13th. And we'll have Matthew here as well to speak on October 23rd. Also, just to mention, David Lamalos, who is also on exhibit here, will be back in November, on November 7th, for a film screening and a conversation. So mark those on your calendar. Be sure to check us out online, check us out on Facebook, follow us, do whatever you need to do to stay informed. There's lots of great things coming up this fall. So thank you again, and please help me in welcoming Carla.
Thanks, Brian. And thank you all for coming this evening. As Brian said, I am an associate curator here at the museum. And I worked very closely with Scott to produce the exhibition. And so Field Station is an annual cycle of projects where we invite artists to experiment with their practice, present new work, maybe do something they've never had the chance to do before. And I think that Scott's exhibition is a really good example of the purpose and the goals of the program. So Scott has one of the most interesting and detailed bios I've ever read. And I'm going to read a small excerpt, and I encourage all of you to read it on his website. It's very funny. Scott Hocking was born in Redford Township, Michigan in 1975. He has lived and worked in Detroit proper since 1996. He creates site-specific installations, sculptures, and photography projects, often using found materials and neglected locations. Inspired by subjects ranging from ancient mythologies to current events, his artworks focus on transformation, ephemerality, chance, and the cycles of nature. He's left-handed and wears contact lenses. He has a speech impediment and was once hypnotized in an effort to correct this. He is a Pisces, born on the day of creative isolation, in the week of the loner, and the year of the cat. A psychic once told him he would have an average life and die at 88. He doesn't know how to roller skate, ice skate, ski, or drive a stick shift. He can read palms. He grew up on a dirt road near a railroad track with a dog named Bubba, who sometimes slept on the kitchen table. His spirit animals are the dog, which walks on his left, and the crow, which flies on the right. His childhood nickname was Scooter. He's a sixth-generation Detroiter, descendant from the Baltic Polish immigrants, and a long line of Cornish copper miners who settled in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. 2 dogs have bitten him in his life, one on the right calf, once above the right eye. His favorite films are The Samurai and The Road Warrior. He has been arrested 6 times and accumulated more traffic tickets than anyone you know. His artwork has been exhibited internationally, including the Van Abbe Museum, the Kunstwerke Institute, Kunsthalle Wien, and the French Triennial Lille 3000 Renaissance, and nationally at the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, the Smart Museum of Art, the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, Contemporary Art Museum St. Louis, the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, the Mattress Factory Art Museum, the Detroit Institute of Arts, Cranbrook Art Museum, the Museum of Contemporary Art Detroit, and of course with us, the Eli and Edith Broad Art Museum at MSU, and at the University of Michigan Institute for the Humanities. Very impressive. He has received multiple awards, including a Kresge Artist Fellowship, a Knight Foundation Arts Challenge Grant, and an Efferson Contemporary Arts Fellowship, as well as residential grants in France, Iceland, Australia, Canada, Brazil, and throughout the United States. He's represented by David Klein Gallery in Detroit. And please give a warm welcome to Scott Hocking.
Hi. The bio is even longer and more ridiculous, and I think a very important part of the bio is that when I was in elementary school, a barnyard turkey took a shit on my head. She edited that one out, but I see that as a really good luck point in my life. Just listening to all those places, I've been very fortunate, and I've traveled all over the world doing different exhibitions. But I did start from very humble beginnings. So what I typically like to do when I do slide lectures is just kind of give you a little bit of an overview of my practice and where I started from. So it will be kind of chronological. And then we'll end up at the installation in this museum. But as you can tell from this very obvious written word at the top of the screen, I'm from Detroit. I'm actually from a little white trash buffer zone suburb of Detroit called Redford Township. When I was a kid, I lived on a dirt road. They would oil it to keep the dust down, and I lived right by the railroad. This is a kind of reoccurring theme in my life, the railroad tracks. Pretty much everywhere I've lived within walking distance from the train tracks, which I often do, walk on the train tracks. Also, the sound of the train at night became something very comforting to me, something that I just resonate with no matter where I've traveled in the world. And I think as I've grown as an artist and worked over the years, I've started to become more and more interested in my own personal connection to trains. So, Detroit. These are images I took when I was at art school in the late 90s of the neighborhoods around the College for Creative Studies, which is where I got my bachelor degree. I show these images because for many years I didn't have a car. For many years I was poor and broke, and I will say that part of the reason I didn't have a car was connected to these 6 times I was arrested and many traffic tickets. But I just started to really utilize my environment. In Detroit, that environment in the 90s was a lot of wasted material and wasted spaces. So for me, I didn't necessarily see these places as sad or maybe negative in the sense of the word decay. I didn't see them as places where they needed to be eliminated and cleaned up and fixed. I saw them as places of potential material, places where I could get free material to make sculptures, to try and maybe potentially change perceptions of what people consider to be junk or wasted material. Specifically, I found myself, I would say, irritated by, when you come from a very working class background, irritated by what I consider to be wealth, people who owned big buildings, owned factories, owned property in Detroit, who had then let it go to waste, neglected it. So using what was wasted became a big deal to me. And you'll see that transition pretty quickly here. The front of this car ends up in a box there. This was the first major site-specific installation that I did in Detroit. Before this, I had been doing a lot of individual sculptures out of found objects, but at this point, I started to think more installation-based, thinking about an entire space. So this installation was made up of over 400 individual boxes, all of them filled with artifacts and objects that I had collected throughout Detroit. It was a collaborative piece with a Detroit painter named Clinton Snyder, and we both did our maybe half of the 400 each. I will say I did way more than Clint, though. Skip can attest to that. Clint's not here, he can't defend himself. But it was the first really large-scale piece I did and really made me start to think installation-wise. You can see in this photo there's a little boat. So this was another thing which was a new step for me. I had been photographing and documenting boats that had been abandoned around Detroit for years, since the 90s, but this is the first time I took one of them and put it in a gallery. Here it is out in the field where I got it. It had a tree growing through it, and I put it in a gallery where there was a column growing through it. And that was kind of the idea of how an object changes when it's in a different context became really important to me around this time. I was really curious about how people decided what was an art object, what makes something art versus not. If someone was walking in this field, how would they perceive this boat versus in a gallery? So I started to play with that more. This is an installation that, again, was born from, a lot of times my ideas are born from irritation. So in this case, I was very irritated at this abandoned trailer park on the city's east side by City Airport that for decades had been used as a dumping ground for tires and other things, trash. But in general, a lot of Detroit was seen as a dumping ground by people. And in this case, tires, which cost money to recycle properly, it would be very easy for a tire company to take your tire off your car, put a new tire on, and then once they got a truck full of used old tires, drive into Detroit at night and dump them somewhere rather than pay for them to be recycled properly. So this kind of stuff naturally bothers me. And in this case, I decided I would start to make an installation out of these tires. But instead of making it on site at the trailer park, it was a very interesting serendipitous thing that happened where I was asked, would I be interested in making an installation for the inaugural fundraiser for the Museum of Contemporary Art Detroit, which had just been created. It hadn't even opened yet. And so me, thinking that no one would say yes to this, I said, well, what if I brought over 2,000 nasty, scum-filled used tires from vacant lots in Detroit and brought them to the front lawn of this wealthy patron's house and made a sculpture out of it, and they said yes. And I thought, crap, now I have to do this. So yeah, it was probably the most disgusting project I ever did because when tires sit outside for a long time, as some of you might know, they get water in them and the water doesn't come out. And that water gets nasty and lots of things start to live in that water. And every time you throw a tire full of water, it's amazing how it splashes right back in your face. Every time. You try and dodge it, but it hits you in the face. So it was gross. And then I got to ruin the lawn. I was happy about that too. But in the end, they recycled all these tires. So these tires, probably 2,109 equaled about $4,300 they paid to get these recycled. And that little bit I felt really good about. Another kind of ongoing interest of mine is history. I've become quite the history nerd. And in Detroit, I became obsessed with ancient history of Detroit. I'm interested in ancient history, period. I'm interested in reflecting on how we perceive ancient people, how we perceive people through time, and how we will be perceived in the future. So studying ancient history to me has become of paramount importance. It influences a lot of my works. And studying Detroit has continued on. It's kind of an ongoing project studying the ancient history of Detroit. The only real piece I've created from that so far, here you can see the Great Mound of the Rouge, and this is what it looks like now. It's one of the most industrialized parts of the city. But the only thing I've really finished with that is my own midden mound with all the junk from my studio, which I then had to bring back to my studio. So in the end, I just put it in a gallery and brought it back. But spaces in the city which I've used multiple times that kind of became second homes include old factories, lots of giant old factories. This factory I've lived within walking distance of for over 20 years now, and I spent a lot of time there. I'd spend time there gathering materials early on, but then I started to spend time there just because I liked being there. I've really become aware over time of how much nature is important to me, and as a kid growing up where I did, finding nature wasn't always so easy. And I would find it in places that might be considered unusual for finding nature. But for me, those were places like the railroad tracks and vacant buildings that had been reclaimed by nature. So I could climb to the roof of this building and be on the roof with trees and the wind and get a view over the city the same way if there was a hill. Detroit's very flat, there's not a lot of hills. So things like that were kind of my solaces. They became my places where I could get some kind of connection with nature. Birds were living in these buildings. Water was going through and dripping like it would in a cave, making stalactites and stalagmites. These became places I found important to my well-being. They became meditative to me. So I started to think, instead of taking material out, why not just work on site? Why not stay in these buildings and work there? It was more important to me to be there than it was to take things out of there. So this was the first project where I really just worked on site. It's a project where I used the floor blocks, the wooden pine and end grain wood blocks that used to line the floors of factories. It would basically be for like shock absorption for all the machines. And they had buckled in these beautiful vein-like patterns over the years, and I just started to use them. And I built this pyramid out of 6,100, let's say over 6,000 wooden blocks that I'm sure at some point I did the math on, because it's a pyramid and you can just count the sides and add it all up. But it took me 8 months. And during that time period, it was a great lesson in letting go of control, a great lesson in not caring so much about the end result, but rather focusing on the process. And there were many times I'd come and go, or I'd be gone for weeks and come back and something had changed. Maybe people had come and graffitied it, or knocked it over, or altered it. There was a time in March where suddenly all the ice that was underneath it thawed and the whole thing shifted. There was a time when I was in there and there were scrappers inside and they were cutting down metal pipes. And I came back weeks later and they had removed the pipe over the top, but didn't affect the piece. And I thought, wow, even the scrappers thought it was interesting what I was doing. All those dynamics became really important to me. One time I was in there and the building started to get fenced off by the city while I was in there, while scrappers were in there. And I said to the scrappers, I'm going to leave. What are you doing? And they said, oh, we're staying. I left. I came back the next day. The scrappers waited till the city had fenced off the whole building, and then they took the fence. So, I mean, I see a lot of interesting things working like this. I then went to China and did about a month-long stay there and worked in a building in China where I did something similar. I used the material on site, the bamboo scaffolding and the blocks, to make another kind of ancient symbol, kind of playing with what's an ancient ruin versus a modern ruin theme. But the big difference was the project in Detroit, where it took me 8 months to build. It was maybe a month after I finished those photos, the EPA came in and cleaned out that building. And I honestly think a big reason why that happened was because there was an article that came out about my project. Otherwise, this could have gone on. Like in Detroit, sometimes buildings will be in this state for decades. But in China, I got in this building, and 2 weeks later, it was demolished. Like, it could have been demolished while I was in there, but I got lucky. Back in Detroit, another building that I worked with was the old Roosevelt Warehouse, which was an old post office that became a public school warehouse. You can see how many books were left in there. The building had burned multiple times. The books had turned into soil. Plants were growing in the soil. It was kind of an amazing transition of nature. That building has also been cleaned out now. But it was kind of like an archaeological dig for me. And again, I took things out of this building with the idea that these are future artifacts. How will these future artifacts be perceived by future people? If you were to excavate these stalagmites and stalactites, how do you interpret that in the future? The one in the center is a melted pile of orange cones with a stalagmite on top of it. How do you interpret that? This is a bundle of plastic drinking straws that was burned. I'm fascinated by that because we all know plastic is going to last a long time. So thinking about how we'll be perceived by our artifacts is a big part of how I work now, and it also is fueled by thinking about how we interpret people from the ancient past. The Book of Knowledge, it's a super boring, like, third grade textbook, but it's got a really cool title. These are like mnemonic devices so you can learn words, but it becomes a freeze. And the books were all called discoveries. So I made this kind of like cauldron of discoveries. I did a project at the Contemporary Museum in St. Louis where I focused on the origins of St. Louis being called Mound City. That's a map of Mound City before it became St. Louis. So I went to the sites where all the mounds were, the ancient earthworks made by the Mississippian culture around the year 800, the year 1000. This is a culture that we don't talk about, we don't learn about in school, but the population of Cahokia, which is in East St. Louis, was larger than London in the year 1000. Like, this is fascinating history, but kind of hidden history. So I made my own mound at one of the sites that turned out in current times was a abandoned toxic waste transfer station. And those are all used rubber gloves. I made one out of barrels. So our mounds are much worse than the ancient mounds, but we're still making mounds. And then, of course, they boarded up the building once I started working in it. Same with the pyramid piece, the tire pyramid piece. When I started moving all those tires out of the abandoned trailer park that had been vacant for years, only then did the city come and barricade it because they saw action. I was taking all the tires out and they finally stopped it. And I did another exhibition inside the Museum of the Artifacts. The Packard plant in Detroit is another really iconic vacant building that I decided to work within. There was an area where the roof had collapsed, and it had been collapsing slowly over many, many years. I'd watched it collapse, 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 collapse. But what it left were these columns, these Albert Kahn martini glass columns that I thought of were like pedestals. And I decided I'd make a new pantheon of the gods. So it's called the Garden of the Gods, and those are televisions that were found elsewhere in the building. Again, using what's found on site, working with the site, thinking site specifically, and photographing it, documenting it over time. Also, by this point, I was thinking of the projects as both sculptural installations that people would encounter, but also photo series. So the photo series mindset was that I'm making these giant props for photos. And I would think of it in those two ways. And I really was interested in the dichotomy between the audience who's going to find these on site and encounter these on site, and the audience who's going to see the photos in a white cube type space. A different kind of person. Upstate New York, I worked with an old powerhouse. Someone had dumped a lot of trash inside. It looks like a lot of styrofoam. So I hauled that styrofoam up to the top floor. Had to sleep in there one night when the cops were there. Built a sphere, made it float like the voice of space, which is a painting by Magritte, and decided I was Sisyphus, building this big ball. It would get destroyed. I'd have to do it again. But I never went back, so I was like a one-time Sisyphus. In Detroit, I did a project called Tartarus, which, as you can see, Tartarus is worse than hell, but better than chaos. Tartarus was the place where Sisyphus was punished and put in mythology. It's where, what's the god? I forget. There was the god who had his liver constantly eaten out, but I forget which one it was. Prometheus, thank you. And the god Tantalus, who was punished to forever be hungry and forever be thirsty. He would go to take a sip of water, the water would vanish. He'd go to take a low-hanging fruit, the trees would move away. So in this case, the fruits hanging on the trees are all the plastic grocery bags that I found in Detroit once winter ended, and they were just all stuck on the fences and stuck in the trees. God knows how many thousands of plastic nasty bags I put in this small installation space in Detroit called the Public Pool. But what I really loved is when people came to the exhibit and walked in there, and they got crowded in there and their heads were starting to touch it, and they were getting really uncomfortable. Another installation I did, I like to play with transformational ideas, symbology based on alchemy. In this case, this was an alchemical installation using a mercury, a 1955 mercury. So I was playing with the idea of mercury as material, salt, and sulfur, and those are the kind of 3 ingredients in the alchemical transformation process. I did 2 versions of it. I used about 300 taxidermied animals from the former Grand Rapids Natural History Museum, all these taxidermied birds and animals that can never be shown again because when they were made, they used arsenic in the taxidermy process, and so they're sitting in these beautiful diorama cases that used to be brought to schools in a closet, basically. There's about 1,000 of them, but I got to borrow about 300 for this. The End of the World bookshelf, all books related to ideas of how the world will end. I did this exhibition called The End of the World around the Mayan calendar end date to play with ideas of how people perceive the world ending or what that means to people. The train station in Detroit, another iconic vacant building that has been bought by Ford and is going to become completely renovated. But when I first went into the train station, it was a vacant building that you could drive your car inside of. It was a homeless hotel. People could pick their room and live in their room in the train station. It was amazing, but it got really, really deteriorated over many years. Vandals would come in and just throw things off the roof, break windows. Eventually the elements get in and eventually it starts to fall apart. The waiting room, a view from the roof. So you get the idea. Well, in this building, the walls were lined with marble. The bathroom stalls were separated by like sheets of marble. It was so beautifully, ornately designed. But after many years of being vacant, people just ripped all the marble off the walls, and it was all on the floors. So again, using what was wasted, I decided to make a sculpture with the marble. I made an egg. I had a kind of visual idea of an egg shape based on a lot of things. I think there's a very similar to pyramids and other kind of archetypal forms, geometric forms. The egg has a lot of symbology connected to it through history, from primitive cultures to, contemporary ideas. It's like the unborn idea. It's like this gestating potential. And to me, it was also this kind of, like the human aura is this like energy orb around you, supposedly, that you just have at all times. There's something figurative about this. So people would walk through the building and then turn and look down the hallway on the 8th floor and see this. And they were like encountering an entity in my mind. So it was fascinating again to see how people reacted to this, and much like most of my projects like this, people encounter them and then they have to decide, do I want to photograph this? Do I want to graffiti this? Do I want to try and knock it over? It's often this thing, either I want to revere it or destroy it. And one of my favorite parts was that midway through I was building it, it got very heavy. And at that point, the asbestos abatement crews had started cleaning out the train station. We basically worked out a deal where they would work on one floor, they wouldn't bother me. But when I got about halfway through, they said I have to stop because they were afraid it was going to fall through the floor. It was too heavy. And I thought, okay, I'm done. But I got a phone call 2 months later. They had built this for me on the floor below, so I could keep working. And similar to the scrappers in the earlier story, to me that is really an amazing thing when I can connect with people who I know have no connection to the art world and we can find like a common conversation. To me, like we just collaborated with this piece. Just an overall series of cast concrete buildings, collecting stalagmites, exhibiting them. That's me on a giant dodo. That's not weird. It's totally normal. I did an installation where I gathered a bunch of abandoned tourist trap figures. In this case, it was a biblical tourist trap mixed with a prehistoric tourist trap. I did a project in the mattress factory in Pittsburgh where I incorporated those same figures and materials, but worked with this hot metal car, which is a kind of train car, train tracks, train connection, that would haul molten iron in the steel industry. So again, I made this kind of future, primitive, pseudo-mystical, installation of just like, people would come in and say, okay, what the hell is this? It's a ceremonial site, but for what? Like, what is this about? I like playing with the idea of a kind of obscure object of worship. So this is the object of worship in this installation. If people find these train cars 1,000 years from now, what will they think of them? Will they think they found some mysterious artifact? Will they worship that artifact? How will they interpret us? And on the inside, if you're an intrepid art explorer, there's a den. You can read books like Dante's Inferno. Another version of it in Grand Rapids. I did a project in Wolfsburg, which is where the Volkswagens are made in Germany. Worked in an abandoned quarry, again, made this kind of figure-type stone cairn sculpture. This is a first of a series of Sputniks I made. It's at the MCA in Chicago. Just kind of like mysterious artifacts, and this is some crop circle designs I made in vacant lots in Detroit with a weed whipper. I call them lot circles. Installation in an abandoned factory in Detroit that had been renovated for an art exhibition, using only materials found in the building. So this was kind of like the history of the family who owned the buildings for 3 generations. I made a kind of strange headquarters of their lives. In the Michigan's Thumb, I took down this 1890s barn. I was commissioned to do it, and we found a farmer who allowed me to use his barn. Put in these telephone poles and started rebuilding the barn as a sculpture. In this photo, you can see a storm tried to kill me. I survived. This is the inside of the barn. Nobody can see this except me. I have like a secret tunnel that I can't tell you all the secrets, okay, but I can get inside there. And that's what it looks like finished. So it's roughly the same dimensions as the original barn, but a very different shape and very confusing. And for me, this is another theme I really like. If I can make people say, what the fuck is that? Then it's success for me. So in this case, people are used to driving this road back and forth. Or maybe they're just used to driving in rural places and seeing barns. They're used to seeing decaying barns. They're used to seeing functioning barns. It's part of the peripheral landscape. If they're driving and they do a double take and think, wait a minute, what is going on with that barn? That looks like a weird barn. What do they put in that barn? If their car starts to slow down and then they think to investigate further, like these are all things I think of as effective because it's getting people, they're getting jogged out of whatever kind of mundane routine they're used to. They're getting a glimpse of an alternate reality. It makes them think about things differently. To me, that's success, even if they hate it. It's just that the fact that it affected them enough to make them slow their car down or maybe turn and investigate further, that's important to me. In northern France, I did a project in a city called Lille, which is about an hour north of Paris. And it's another old train station. So if you haven't noticed a train theme yet, I'll just say the word train like 10 more times. But this old train station in Lille, they asked me to do an installation in the rear part of it, which was vacant, where I made this kind of ceremonial, mysterious, archaeological site. Again, obscure object of worship, based on the stories of Babel, kind of mythological stories of Babel in all of its ways. But the interesting thing about this project was they told me, you've got all this space, you can do whatever you want. However, no one can walk back here. So we're going to make a window that people can look through, and you can make a piece around the window too. So I had this strange like double piece, this salon-style wall, and then a window to this like archaeological dig site. But no one could get back there. So nobody could even see this vantage point. Only I could. And again, that's interesting to me. Like this is an installation made for me sometimes, not for anyone else. I saw a lecture years ago by the artist Dennis Oppenheim, who's dead now, and I think he was quite old even when I saw him talk. But it was one of those light bulb moments I had where he was showing slides of when him and his family lived in some cabin in the middle of nowhere. And the slides were of installations he had been making in this cabin. They were, I feel like in my memory, they were almost Rube Goldberg type contraptions. And at some point when he was talking, I realized he's showing us these slides and talking about this, but without him showing me these slides, nobody would have known this even existed. Like he wasn't doing it for the art world, he wasn't doing it for a gallery, he was doing it just because he liked doing it, and he happened to take slides of it. I thought that was amazing. So a big part of working like this is that a lot of the things I'm doing, I don't care if anybody sees them. I'll probably document them for myself. I might even make a photo series out of them. But it's not so important to me that people see it or encounter it. If they do, I'm curious what their reaction is. But if they don't, that's okay too. Abandoned recycling plant in Indianapolis. Very interesting situation because it was originally the RCA factory of Indianapolis that was printing like Elvis records, and then years later became a recycling plant, and then of course the recycling plant went abandoned and all the recycled materials never got recycled. So what do I want to do? I want to take all the unrecycled material out and get them recycled. I made an installation that's kind of like this foam glacier, and all the artifacts that were plastic that I found to be kind of like strange alien sculptures. I cleaned up, I curated, and I made an exhibition out of them. I love it when people see shows like this and then they want to know how I made them. Really cool sculptures, how did you make them? And I say, it took a long time. But all the foam had to be recycled after. A vacant lot in Grand Rapids, another project in Grand Rapids. This garage is being torn down. I turned it into another Sputnik. It's the second Sputnik I made. It's called Rustic Sputnik. The first one was called Rusty Sputnik. I did this last year in a building that was going to be demolished in Austin. Concrete blocks. I decided to make a hanging cairn, kind of like a burial pod, this strange cocoon type shape. That was fun because it was very much the kind of sculpture that could fall and kill someone at any moment. No one died. And then the most recent exhibition I had at the David Klein Gallery in Detroit was based on a lot of things, my own genealogy. I did a lot of research into my own genealogy, found out that half my family comes from copper mining, people who came from Cornwall, England to the UP. And that was interesting to me because I've been doing research for years on the most ancient people in Michigan, the old copper complex, who was basically natives who were trading copper up to 6,000 years ago from the Upper Peninsula. I mean, they find artifacts around here connected to that. So to me, this became a really interesting theme, copper. It's also something in Detroit that's always been very important. Scrapping of metal in Detroit is incredibly connected to copper. When we were in the Iraq War, the copper prices skyrocketed, and entire roofs of buildings in Detroit that were copper were stripped. So this theme of copper has become very important to me. So I decided to make an installation out of copper, based on my ancestry, based on the history of Detroit. This kind of like central drill bit, and the salt in the middle is connected to the Detroit salt mines that are deep beneath the city of Detroit. But again, just playing with, I don't know. The truth is I had a dream. I mean, Christine, who's the director of David Klein, could tell you that I came back from the Florida Keys around Art Basel, and I was like, I had a dream that I filled a gallery with skulls. So sometimes I get ideas from dreams. Okay, finally, now we are talking about the installation I have here. That's just the front of a train. But these are the old fronts of trains. They were called cowcatchers. There's a much more professional term for that, but I'm just going to call it the cowcatcher, which is the colloquial expression. But it was basically a scoop that would knock anything off the tracks that would be in the way, including cows. I did one semester at MSU in 1993, right out of high school. It was like the perfect time period for me to get nothing done. Somewhere in high school, I started smoking a lot of pot. I started getting really, really interested in metaphysical things, reading philosophy, Eastern philosophy, getting drunk and smoking a lot of pot, and that's when I decided to go to college. So my semester at MSU was basically me never going to class. I missed all my final exams except one. I spent a lot of time dropping acid. I would hike around the preserves that are part of campus. I'd walk along the railroad tracks. I had a lot of really interesting experiences here Mostly none of them had to do with school. And then after that one semester, I dropped out. But I had a really interesting thing happen where one of the classes I had here was an art class, and the teacher was a grad student at MSU at the time. And years later, after being kind of transient and aimless and living in my car and having kind of real ups and downs in my life, and really hitting rock bottom, which led me to go to the art school in Detroit. I got into a car accident, and I ended up at the art school in Detroit in January of '97. When I started school at the art school in Detroit, my foundations professor was the same teacher that I had at MSU. His name was Brian Nelson. He's a sculptor. He teaches at Eastern. And I thought, wow, this is kind of really interesting. I wonder how he's going to remember me, right? Yeah, there's more to that story, but there's things that have happened in my life where I feel like it's a nice full circle circumstance. So when Carla asked me to do an exhibition here, one of my first instincts was, ooh, I want to revisit my time, who I was in my life when I took my one semester at MSU. So I dropped a ton of acid again. I'm just kidding. I didn't do acid. Drugs are bad for you, okay? I did none of that. Actually, that'd be a really bad idea at this point in my life. I would probably die. I just decided I would revisit not only trying to remember what I was doing at that time in my life, but also books I was reading, music I listened to, just revisiting and trying to see if I got ideas. When I first came up here, I went for some walks. I walked along the tracks again. I went through the preserve that I can't remember the damn name of, but it's this big place you can walk around. I just tried to revisit and get ideas from that. And yeah, one of the big things I remembered was a book I had read, Native American, basically biography called Lame Deer, Seeker of Visions. And some quotes from that book that I remember underlining because they really resonated with me. And this one in particular, I still really like the part where he says, they're not even aware of this, so they stumble along blindly on the road to nowhere, a paved highway, which they themselves bulldoze and make smooth so that they can get faster to the big empty hole which they'll find at the end, waiting to swallow them up. It's a quick, comfortable superhighway, but I know where it leads to. I've seen it. I've been there in my vision, and it makes me shudder to think about it. So even before I thought about art and installations and thinking sculpturally, I remember that giving me a visual. And then later, years later, I wanted to make an artwork that talked about this kind of like, this black hole, this like movement towards this black hole. And to me, even though I've always been connected to the railroad, I also think of the railroad as this kind of like, just imagine the pristine wooded landscape of Michigan before it was all forested. And then just imagine these like metal tracks and these like soot blowing black monsters just ripping through the landscape and cutting and hauling all the trees out. And how that changed, how the Industrial Revolution like changed the landscape here. To me, that's a really powerful image. So playing with those themes are a big part of what led to this sculpture, this installation. The earth would roll up like a carpet with all the white man's works, the fences, the mining towns with their whorehouses, the factories, the farms with their stinking, unnatural animals, and the railroads and the telegraph poles, the whole works. Trust me, I had an idea I wanted to bring telephone poles in here at one time, because telephone poles, like railroad ties, are also impregnated with creosote, which preserves them. So, after playing with a lot of different ideas and talking with Carla and talking about the staff here, I decided I wanted to make an installation out of railroad ties. Railroad ties, like these piles here, are basically the wood timbers that were laid down, that the steel rails were put atop to make the railroad track. Some of these timbers have been replaced over the years with newer ones, and the ones that have been pulled out that often end up piled up like this on railroad property, and they'll sit like this if the railroad people can have their way forever. Because why deal with it when you own so much property and you're the railroad? So you just find these piles of old timbers smelling like creosote all over Detroit, all over the world, really. All over America, for sure. And I think it's this kind of dichotomy where I think there's something nostalgic about it. For me, that smell reminds me of walking the railroad tracks from childhood. All of the time I've spent exploring Detroit and other cities all over the world where I took the railroad as a path. That smell is important to me. But it's also, creosote is a coal tar derivative of making coal. It's a carcinogen. It's oily. It's nasty. It's basically they've stopped using it to preserve wood. They started to do womanizing instead. So when you see telephone poles now, they're more of a green color. They're not this black, old, oily, stinky thing. So there's two sides of it, and I think there's something really interesting about that dichotomy. To me, that happens here because I come from a very working class background. This is a very working class circumstance. People who work on the railroad, people who made the railroad, these piles of railroad ties. This is something that isn't in a museum. So I'm interested in putting it in a museum and confronting the museum audience with that smell, with that object, with that world. The same way I imagine a lot of the people who work on the railroad have never entered this museum. And they'd probably be confronted with art if they were to come in here in a similar way. So to me, that's an interesting transition. Here I am in my Jim Ashmore rental truck. Big plug for Jim Ashmore. About 300 ties, as Connor can attest to. We had to move these ties around. Different sizes, weights. Some of them weigh 300 pounds each. Some of them are just little splinters and fragments. Some are so old that you can see the hatchet marks when they were making them square with hand tools because they didn't have mills yet. Like, to me, that's Michigan history. It's not just the history of the railroad, it's the history of the lumber here and the old growth trees, just like that barn I built, the old growth trees that are all gone now. So there's history involved. We had to spray them, pesticide spray them, and then bundle them back up, and then plop them in front of the museum. And now I'm going to show you pictures of things you can look at in person, but you're going to look at them on the screen here. You can't see this. So the back side of it, it's like the skeleton of it. But you can see like the infrastructure of it. To build it, to make it the way we wanted to make it with the material we had to kind of make this skeletal structure that could be built up. To me, the shape not only references the Cowcatcher, I think it mimics the architecture of the building. Maybe even unintentionally. I was talking about this earlier to Carla when we were doing an interview. I think that maybe subliminally, peripherally, I started to unconsciously mimic shapes of the building. If you're out on Farm Lane and you look at the building, it sure as hell looks like a train moving through space. And I think there's really an interesting parallel there. I also think that there's something ship-like about it. And the word ship in like the broadest sense of the term, you could say it's an overturned hull of a wooden ship, but there's also something about it like the way this building looks like a futuristic spaceship. I feel like, this is my joke, but I feel like this is the 1850s version of this spaceship. It's just like, what kind of spaceship would they make back then? A really weird wood one. And the metal objects are just all things I've gathered over years, really decades, in my walks along the railroad tracks. Artifacts I've collected that I think of as talismans. Most people wouldn't know what these tools are for, what they were used for. So I see them as these kind of like, they mimic this ceremonial tool that if you were to interpret it in a future time, you would have to think like, what were they using this for? Oh, well, I think the humans were definitely coming to this site, worshiping. This was their temple structure, and these were probably the guys in charge, probably came and grabbed these staffs during the ceremony. I like playing with that idea and having people come to their own conclusions. And in the end, I'll take all the metal things back because I'm a hoarder and I always think I'm going to use things again. And the wood will probably get rid of in the proper way. I'm looking somehow. We'll figure it out. Yeah. I think we're going to figure it out. It's going to be disposed of properly. Some of it will be reused. Some of those ties are in pretty good shape. But yeah, I want to touch again on the smell, because it was an interesting thing. When we did the exhibition, there were some people who got really concerned about the smell. So we had it like repeatedly tested so that it was proven that everything was okay. But again, to me, that was a really great example of the audience coming into a museum being confronted with something that they might not be used to. And I really liked that element. And I have to say, it was fantastic to work here with a team of people who, instead of saying, we can't do that, they were like, we're going to figure out how to do that. And so that was fantastic. So I'm going to wrap up just showing you a current project I just installed in Detroit that's currently still installed. Oh, I'm going to have to go through these great images first. iPhone images I just threw in the last second. More artifacts. This is called 17 Shitty Mountains. It's an installation I just did for the Murals in the Market Festival in Eastern Market of Detroit. Again, it's using a vacant facility that used to be a Detroit water and sewerage plant. There were all these concrete sewer pipes and other concrete artifacts that were wasted and sitting there for decades. So they asked me to do something site-specific. I walked through there and I said, okay, I want to use these concrete pieces, but I need a machine. They rented the machine. And I basically spent a week moving things around. So in some cases, I have 8 months or 2 years to do a project. In other cases, I have a week. And I just try and work site-specifically and figure out what I can do in that time. In this case, I tried to make a kind of pseudo-ceremonial site again with the pipes. This is the kind of Stonehenge version, which I call Scotthenge or Hermaphrohenge or Shitty Stonehenge. Someone has already come and started to do graffiti on it. So another element of this that I really like is that element of chance and the unknown. Somebody's going to come and start painting on these. So what are they going to paint? Who's going to paint what where? Will they be painted over? This person did a really clever thing. They made this one into like a little Frankenstein, Marshmallow Man or something. Pretty nice views from inside the building. And this kind of Stonehenge complex is it's 9 of the 17 shitty mountains. Here's another shitty mountain. There's another one. There's a nice one with the American flag in it, because America. This one's one of my favorites. It's nice and isolated. It's also been one of the ones that's been immediately tagged. So the most recent photos of it, you can see graffiti all over it. I think they're very figurative. I think of the tops almost being like oculuses, and they're almost like looking in different directions. So again, someone driving through Eastern Market to go get their vegetables might do a double take and think, did I just see a fucking Stonehenge sculpture? And then they can investigate further. So to me, this is an interesting thing. It brings people into a place they wouldn't normally go, and maybe makes them think, even for a moment, differently about that place. And this is the most recent graffiti I really like. Because I really like that they chose the palette they did. It matches the sky and the plants around it. But they were also thinking about that oculus, that eye, that looking. I was impressed with that one. And I have a feeling it's not going to get graffitied over. But like most of my projects, I'm not sure what the fate of this is going to be yet. It's kind of unknown. I'll probably find out soon enough because things change pretty quickly. But yeah, unlike ones where I'm in an exhibition in a museum space where there's a definite end, things like this, it's a little bit more ambiguous. At least in this case, though, each one of these things, those concrete pipes weigh about 5 tons each. So when there's a tower that's 3 tall, that's 15 tons or 30,000 pounds. It's going to be a lot harder for someone to knock that over than other things I've done. But yeah, that's where I'm at right now. Thank you. I imagine we're going to do a Q&A now.
Yeah, if you'll allow us. Fantastic. Let's give him another round of applause. That was great.
How did I do for time? Am I okay for time?
Yeah, good.
I've got an internal clock. I'm like a cicada. Thank you.
So we are going to open it up to questions. I do ask that you use the microphone so that not only Scott but the rest of us can hear your question. Don't feel like you need to be shy. My colleague here, Christian, is going to help me run the mic. So yeah, I can feel the questions.
We got one right over here. Yes. Skip, you're not allowed to ask questions.
How did you not get arrested for doing the stuff in the buildings? I think that those are your most interesting work. And I think that they would arrest you because of liability in the city and all of that kind of stuff. Or have you been arrested and you just didn't want to talk about it?
I have been arrested 6 times, but never for trespassing. And part of that is because I work alone. I'm very interested in kind of like entering and exiting places without any fanfare. I like to be kind of invisible. And even when I'm working on site, I'm very quiet. Again, I'm really interested in the meditative process of working in these spaces. So what people wouldn't, I think if you're watching like CSI, what you don't understand is that these places they're quiet. There's not a lot happening. Like you're often there alone all day. There's no police checking on these buildings. There's no owners. I mean, obviously the owners, even if they exist, are assholes who've neglected it. But in a lot of cases, they're owned by the city, or maybe they're owned by the county, or they're in limbo. They're places that nobody is taking care of. So I never enter places where I need to break in. In most cases, I owe a lot of my ability to get into buildings to the scrappers, the guys who want to get the metal out or anything, because they make the pathways into places. But again, in most cases, the negligent owners are not boarding up doors, they're not keeping things shuttered. If a place is kept shuttered, it usually is kept in pretty good shape. But the scrappers can be like the ants at the picnic, like they'll just keep coming until they can take the watermelon away. And when they figure out that nobody will close it up again, or when I see that, then it becomes, and I will say too, like I'm very picky about where I work. I don't choose places that for whatever reason feel to me like it's not a good idea, it's unsafe, or if I feel like I would be insulting the people who live around a building, like I don't want to be an asshole. So I choose situations that seem like they're the right ones to work in. And that includes ones where I'm not going to get in trouble. That being said, the project in China, that was a weird one. I was basically given permission by a gallery in China, but then once I started working in there, it seemed really clear that they had no permission to give me. And that was scary because I could have ended up in like a Chinese jail, which just seems like a bad idea. And there were a couple other circumstances like that. The danger of working in buildings has never been police. It's never been other humans, really. It's dogs and holes. Falling through holes, dogs that might live in buildings. Often dogs will become feral and make packs, and the packs will make home, and then you're suddenly in their home and they get angry about that. The worst situation would be to fall through a hole into a pile of dogs. But I've never had that happen, thankfully.
Thank you.
Yep.
Anyone else? Yes.
I thought that was going to be Paul. That got real close to you, Paul. I thought you were going to ask a question.
I was just really interested to know, like, how did your ideas of, like, changing how people view junk, like you talked about, correlate with your ideas of using that junk to, like, create a site of worship, or using like old myths as inspiration? Do they have any like relation to each other? Or?
Yeah, well, I would say first of all, my view of junk is it's something very personal. I tell this story, my girlfriend actually thinks I'm making this up, but my earliest memory is of going to the junkyard. I remember being like in a car seat and seeing out the window of the car as we drove on a freeway. And I knew we were going to the junkyard based on the color of the bridge underpasses we would go under. If they were blue, I knew the junkyard. So my father was a mechanic. I mean, I grew up around junk. And I think that I started to embrace the fact that this was so ingrained in me to use dirty, nasty junk from an early age. that it started to take on perhaps even a mythological proportion to me. So there's an element of that. But I think that the truth is that I was always thinking mythologically. I was always thinking about metaphysics, mythology, mysticism. I've always had an interest in alchemy, all these directions, the occult, religion, spirituality. That's just something that I've always been interested in, and I've translated it into my art practice. So it didn't necessarily have to be junk, but there's a theme. I mean, I've done other works that I didn't show you, where I'm still playing with these themes, but it's a deeper theme to me than it is just connecting it to junk. But yeah, I think that there's a very specific theme when talking about ruins. Detroit, for my entire lifetime, has been talked about as a place with a lot of ruins. And I think there's something very interesting about that, because the word ruin can be good or bad. When you go to Rome, you don't go, so sad about all these ruins. No, you go to see the ruins. They're thought of as a monument to the past, or thought of something important. So to me, starting to play with these ideas of what makes this ruin sad and nostalgic, and what makes this ruin an important part of history. So putting a pyramid inside an abandoned auto factory, in some ways, is me trying to say, how are we any different? Are humans doing the same shit over and over again? Are we learning from the past? Do we learn from history? Do we have short-term memories? Like questioning this kind of stuff. So the material might be wasted material and junk, but I think playing with this material to make these kinds of monuments to the past, or monument to our future past, playing with these ideas, thinking of junk as artifacts, connects to mythology to me, connects to history. And history sometimes is mythology. I mean, there's a kind of blurry line there. Does that answer that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Anyone else? Yes.
I have a more logistical question, I guess. Do you feel like there was a shift in your practice where you were, so I'm thinking like you get into abandoned buildings and you can kind of just fuck around for a while, but there must have been a shift where you had the resources to start moving 5-ton blocks and having more, like all the work that went into the installation here. Where in your practice did that shift take place, and sort of how did that come about?
The easy answer to that is that there's never really been a shift. If I want to go work in an abandoned building and fuck around and do a sculpture, no one pays me for that. And I still have to figure out how to do that on my own time. When I spend 8 months in the Fisher body plant building a pyramid out of wooden blocks, nobody pays me for that. Basically, when I did that piece, my friends I think they legitimately thought I was kind of going crazy. Like, what are you doing going there and doing this and getting a coffee and a newspaper before you build a pyramid in an abandoned building? The photos that I've taken of these projects have ended up becoming something that I can use to sell to fund another project that no one will pay for. So this is another thing I learned from another famous artist. I learned that one of the successful techniques that Christo and Jean-Claude employed to do their crazy elaborate installations that nobody wanted to pay for is that Christo would do these immaculate draftsman quality drawings of his proposals, and everybody would be like, that looks great, I don't want you to do it here. But they would buy the drawings, and then with the money from that, he would fund his own projects. So to me, that was a big part. I mean, that might be a shift, that mentality, but the reality is that I might get exhibitions at museums or galleries that have a budget. I might get commissions, and there might be a budget. And often that's for things in white cube type spaces. But I'm still in the same place as ever, where if I want to do a project in sites, off sites, I have to figure it out myself. Mm-hmm. The first time I've ever been commissioned to do a site-specific work in a so-called abandoned space is the one I just showed you, 17 Shitty Mountains. I was commissioned for the Murals in the Market project to work on site to do something. But still, they got the machine, and I think they rented me a hammer drill, but I didn't get paid for that. Like, it still was basically, it was funded in the sense that I didn't have to rent the machine and the tools. But there's a chance photos of that could sell. They're trying to sell them right now. And maybe I might make some money. But really, it's the same as it ever was. And there are still projects in Detroit that I'd like to do, and I still intend to do, that no one knows about. I have to keep them secret, really, because otherwise they might never get done. And they might take years to complete. So it's like a lot of things in my life. There isn't like a shift. It's just more like a organic, amoeba-like morphing situation. I'm still broke, is what I'm trying to tell you. Still broke. Everyone buy my artwork.
Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation, by the way.
You're welcome.
My question is, how much of your work is improvised versus any pre-thought going into it?
That's a pretty good question. I mean, in cases where it's a museum show, I think that there's a lot of conversation that has to happen beforehand. Sketches even have to be drawn. But still, the conversation is always me saying, the reality is I don't really know what I'm going to do until I get there. When I've done residencies, when I've done projects, I've basically proposed things saying, the reality is I'm not going to have an idea until I get there. Because I say I'm a site-specific artist. So that means I have to be on site to get ideas. The project I just did with these sewer pipes, I had a week to do it, and it was all improvised. The whole project was a sketch. And a lot of times when I'm working, the same way a painter in the studio will paint something and then stand back and look, I'm doing that in these sites. So, or maybe I'll be like, I need to go away and come back in a couple days and look at this with fresh eyes. Like, they are, for me, very much, again, I'm going to use the word organic processes where I figure it out as I go. I might have an idea coming in, but that will shift and change. It's pretty much like how artists should be. You have to be adaptable. I said this today with Carla. I'm going to say it again. It's really important as an artist to learn how to navigate around obstacles, because there's always going to be obstacles. And that will change the course of a project, and you have to go with that and not be like stubborn and say, I'm doing the exact drawing I did. At least that's my opinion. I also don't keep a sketchbook. I can draw pretty good if I want to. I just never do. So it's, for me, oftentimes the installations are figured out while I'm making them, and they become like a sketch.
And do you often scrap any ideas or projects amidst working in them?
I have. I mean, there's a couple buildings in Detroit that have, I spent like a week moving shit around and I stopped. But yeah, I mean, there are definitely ideas. I wouldn't say I ever scrap ideas as much as I like put them on the back burner, the way back burner. But that becomes really useful because I think that sometimes you have ideas, I mean, this is a good example of that come back to the surface a decade later and you incorporate them in a new way. So it's almost like it's always studying. You're always like, you know, kind of working on things over many, many cycles. Yeah, there's ideas that I think I have morphed and changed, but I'm not sure I've ever completely eliminated some.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Who else? Oh, way up front, you're going to have to run.
I'll trot.
So I heard just last week in the newspaper that, you know, there's tourists that always have come to look at the ruins. They want to take tours of the ruins. But there are foreign tourists who are disappointed because the ruins are disappearing or, you know, being fixed up or something like that.
Yeah.
So I don't think you'd have any problem finding some little space to still muck around because there's always all kinds of spaces there. But what would you think if the city of Detroit or the state of Michigan said, well, we have to redo Fort Wayne. It's a historic place. We could pay you to do an installation that would be permanent. What would you think of that?
This is a really like meandering question. It was like statements and then moved all the way to Fort Wayne. So I'm going to try and address the first part, which is ruin tourism. And I mean, I think that even the term ruin porn is connected to this, and just how there's been this amazing interest that has grown exponentially, in my opinion, through the advent of social media, through Flickr, and then through whatever kind of photo sharing apps you have, that suddenly people all over the world can be like, oh, I want to go see this abandoned building in the Ukraine, and they can travel all around, and this is a thing now. I mean, it's a reality that exists. I think that the reason it's different than other times is because we've never seen like the ruins of the Industrial Revolution. We've seen ruins, but this is a new kind of ruin. It's a new kind of circumstance, and we're dealing with it. I would think that there are people who grew up in Rome who get really fucking irritated with the people who want to come see the Colosseum, or who want to come and sit at the McDonald's across from the Pantheon. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think the irritation with ruin tourism is unique to Detroit. And I also don't think the ruination that exists in Detroit is unique to the world. I've traveled a lot. I can tell you, post-industrial wastelands exist all over the world. Again, this is a big problem with humans doing the same shit over and over again. So, yeah, it's irritating that there's people coming in on busloads wanting to see all the ruins. It's irritating that people can come in for a week, photograph things, make a coffee table book. Like, yes, that's really effing irritating. But it's also a reality that I don't think we can escape. It's going to happen. It happens all over. It's been happening forever. Now I'm going to try and get to your next thing. Fort Wayne. So Fort Wayne is a historic military fort built in Detroit in the mid-1800s because there was a time when the U.S. thought the British were going to attack us from what is now Canada. That never happened. It was never used, but it's a beautiful park place now with these decaying barrack houses that were never used and are now falling apart. I think it'd be great if those were stabilized and renovated. I think it would suck if they turned into Starbucks. So to me, there's a line, right? Like Detroit, for example, is a place that I have for many years found really perfect for what I want to do in life. I've been able to afford to live there and work there. I've been able to find my solaces, my quietude, my country in the city. I can also go and get a good coffee now. Like there's restaurants with good food now. Like there's a balance, right? But if Detroit became a suburb with strip malls everywhere, I probably wouldn't want to be there anymore because I'm not really interested in that. So to me, there's just levels and balances. The benefit of Detroit is that it's very spread out. It's very big. There's always areas of Detroit that are kind of untouched from gentrification. For me, those are interesting areas still that I'm interested in. But as the city changes, so does my practice. I work site specifically. If the site changes, my work changes. All of that factors in. Whenever I travel to other places and make work, I mean, it's not always a post-industrial place. I really feel like I get inspired by all the elements of it. So I think we'll have to wait and see what happens to Detroit. I've been there a long time, and things change slowly. They're happening a lot faster than they ever have now, but in certain areas. So it'll be interesting to observe it and see how it goes. And again, with Fort Wayne, I would love, because they're making literally that whole area north of Fort Wayne is the new bridge. That's all going to be a customs plaza. It's really changing quick right around that. But yeah, if it was turned into a really well upkept park that preserved the history, that'd be great. But I would really hate it if it turned into condos.
But the part I want to ask, I think, being really, what would you think about your art being part of that placemaking for the city?
Explain.
So there's, you could go to Heidelberg and bring people brings commerce to the city.
Okay.
You're always assuming that your stuff's going to disappear, right?
Yeah.
But if you were commissioned to work in a historic space,
That's okay.
it would be part of a permanent installation that people would come to Fort Wayne and you'd have your stamp on that.
That's fine. I don't have anything against permanent work. The barn and the thumb is still there. It just so happens a lot of my work doesn't end up being permanent. I'm more interested in seeing, like I'm interested in letting it do what it's going to do. And sometimes that means it gets destroyed, and I'm okay with that. Other times it means someone has a photograph framed on their wall in their house. I'm okay with that. Like, I don't have anything against permanent work. It's just that a lot of the pieces I've made thematically, conceptually, are about me letting go of the ownership of them, letting go of control of them, being okay with them doing whatever they're going to do. And in some cases, that means being destroyed. But yeah, if someone commissioned me, AKA gave me a lot of money to do a permanent piece at Fort Wayne. I mean, here's the thing. The problem is I do it, but I might propose something they don't want me to do. I might say, you know what used to be right here? You know what the fort was built on top of? A native burial ground. How about if I made that again? How about if we talked about that? So I feel like it would depend on that, for sure. Anybody else?
We have time for more?
Do we?
Yeah, a few more.
Oh, no.
You knew it was coming.
Didn't you used to play hockey in these buildings?
Oh,
Is that a bad story?
Oh, it's a bad story. It makes me infuriated. But so Skip said jokingly, "Didn't I used to play hockey in these buildings?" So the reason he said that is because he's my good friend and he likes to rib me, but also because the building next to the train station and the train station itself for many years had a flooded basement, and in the wintertime these flooded basements would freeze. The installation that I did with Roosevelt Warehouse, where I took a lot of artifacts out and made a kind of cauldron of the books that say Discovery, I originally wanted to build that on the frozen ice of the basement floor of that building. I wanted to bring the books down to the basement, build them on the ice, photograph it, and then the piece would vanish once the ice thawed. So it would be documented in the winter and then disappear. And when I was working on that, I encountered people ice skating. In fact, what I first encountered was the tracks in the ice that indicated people had been skating. And I remember my first thought, like an idiot, was that there was one person like figure skating down there. I don't know why I imagined that would be happening, but it turns out it was that there was a group of suburban downriver kids who'd come in and play hockey in the basement of these buildings. So I decided to come back on one weekend and photograph these kids. And I was there for like 4 hours photographing them play hockey. They were drinking, smoking, partying. And then at the very end of the 4 hours, it was probably 10 degrees that day. It was like January. At the very end of that 4 hours, I went to a corner of the basement that was dark to go to the bathroom, take a piss. And when I went over there, there was some light coming from a little elevator shaft. And being the intrepid explorer I am, I ducked under just to see what was in that elevator shaft. And sticking out of the ice were 2 feet. And yeah, what do you do when you find that? So nobody prepares you for that. So it was a very strange moment. I wasn't quite sure what I was looking at, if it was real, because I basically saw shoes, socks, and a pant leg. Was that like at the end of the Oscars when I've like talked over my time?
No.
Is that a ghost? What's happening? It's a ghost story. Don't tell ghost stories while you're lecturing. Yeah, it was, I mean, I can still feel the feeling of confusion, and I ducked back out, and there was a hockey player in the darkness. They had lost the puck, and he was looking for the puck, and I grabbed him, and I said, I have to show you something. And we went back in, and we just stood there, like kind of dumbfounded, like, fuck, what do we do, right? And immediately he started talking about, he was worried because some of the guys playing hockey had warrants or had been arrested for trespassing before. Everybody was drunk in there. I mean, he was worried they would get in trouble. So we like basically negotiated a deal where I was ready to leave and I left, but that once everybody left, he was going to call the cops. Instead, he called his family friend, Charlie LaDuff. Does anyone know who Charlie LaDuff is? LaDuff is a Pulitzer Prize winning writer who used to write for the New York Times, kind of left disgraced and then came back to Detroit, worked for the papers, worked for Fox News. I think he has his own shit going on now. But Charlie is like, he's one of these gonzo writers. And so instead of the cops getting called, Charlie got called, and Charlie brought a Detroit News photographer with him, and they went to the building, they photographed the feet, and then he started a cycle of calling the cops. He basically knew he had a good story. He was like the cartoon guy in the desert seeing a person and they're shaped like a steak. You know, he was like, oh, this is going to be a good story. So he wrote this story that basically made it sound like there were kids playing hockey around a dead body, like skating around it. And that nobody had, I think the story was called Frozen in Indifference, that nobody cared, nobody was concerned. It was literally like 2 days after the hockey player called him that the body was removed. And yet the way the story made it sound, it was like weeks. I mean, everything about it was just egregious exaggeration for his benefit. And it went on to be something where he wrote a book called Detroit, like an autopsy of a city, Detroit, an autopsy of an American city. And he starts with that story. Like he really profited from this circumstance. And it drives me crazy because nobody tells, you're not prepared for how to deal with that. I've never found a dead body in a building before. Nobody prepares you for how to deal with that. But yeah, the kind of thing that you think nobody will try and capitalize on, people will. It's really kind of a shameful thing. And I wrote him an email after all that happened. He didn't know I existed. The hockey player didn't tell him I existed. I wrote him an email, and we ended up getting into an argument, and then we ended up meeting, ironically, at the bar called Honest John's to hash it out. But in that meeting, it became just abundantly clear that he was very, very, there's no talking to Charlie that he had done something like that he had exaggerated or kind of changed the truth for his story. The hockey players were all, I think, really devastated and hurt. Like the kid, I think, was really devastated by making the mistake of calling Charlie instead of the cops. I think he was like forever irritated by that. But yeah, so yeah, that building has a lot of history to me, kind of like bad negative vibes to me. But and it turns out, I will say, that building was a place where a lot of homeless guys lived because they used to live in the train station and they moved next door when the train station became off limits. And I would encounter these homeless guys all the time. When I found the body in the elevator shaft, I knew that the homeless guys lived up in the loading dock. So after that, I went upstairs and talked to them and said, do you know about the guy down there? And they said, oh yeah, we've been trying to figure out who that is. But it was just kind of like, no, I think that the reality was he was another homeless guy, he died, and the homeless guys in there pushed him into the hole so they wouldn't have to deal with it, because otherwise they'd get kicked out, they'd have to have another place to live. So basically, it was like, for them, it was self-preservation. They were still alive on a 10-degree day in January, but this guy died. And when they did the autopsy, he died of a cocaine overdose, which is like a crack overdose. But yeah, it was a very, very bizarre thing. I'm really happy you brought that up, Skip. Super positive note. Can somebody ask a positive question?
Yeah, I don't know that I want to leave it
Don't end on that.
Leave it on that. One more? We have time for one more. Who's got a question?
Ask me about rainbows.
Happy shiny things?
Come on. Really? Aren't you guys like, there it is, yeah.
Were the skulls real?
I don't know if that was a good transition to make. Was that? No, the skulls were made out of plaster, technically gypsum, and then painted with a clear copper impregnated paint. So basically it's a paint. It's really great. It's like one of these things I discovered, and I'm thrilled about it. It's what they use in the special effects industry in movies. So you can buy a clear paint with any kind of metal dust in it, iron, copper, whatever, and then you can paint something, and while it's wet, spray it with patinas, and it will oxidize the way it does in reality. So basically, everything in my studio, if I want, like I could just paint everything with the copper paint, make everything copper now. I mean, you know, without going pure one on it, but I really had fun with that, and there were about 1,000 bones in total. It weighed about a ton. We were interested to see like how that would impact the gallery floor, but it did fine. And my studio is now just like a mess with bones, copper bones everywhere. And I started calling myself Scotty Copperpot during that. So no, they're not, but I made some cast bronze pieces, which are basically copper and tin, and that is my family heritage, the copper and tin miners of the UP. I think the ghost is trying to talk to me up there.
I think we're about at our time. I would be interested to see if we could get this many people into the peanut barrel afterwards. If you
Wow.
want to continue the conversation.
It's not literally a peanut barrel, is it?
It is literally a peanut
That
barrel.
seems, I don't know if I could fit in a peanut barrel.
So let's hear it for Scott Hocking.
Thank you. Thank you.